Hey everybody, what's up? Today's Thursday, January 4th. Market just closed about 15 minutes ago, and we closed pretty low. We're at $5.30. So the first thing you're going to want to hear me say is address the bad call out on my part for a bottom. Yesterday we did bottom out at like 556. Today we dropped that target, went about a 5% lower. I think it's possible that we could go lower still. I don't think for sure that we're on a bottom. There's a lot of different ways to come up with price targets, and one of those ways is using an S-curve. One of them is using fib extensions. One is just using channel lines. Any number of those things could give you some alternating targets, and I've found like several. I think recently I had a post on YouTube, not a video, but just like a post, and it was before winter, and was when we were winter break, and I was saying that when the breakdown started happening, there's a lot of possibility that we don't recover. And so you look at the downside targets, and we had targets down to like 490. I even had some targets that I didn't really post that were like 330, but I talked about in other places. Just there's different areas where you've had different levels, right? And $6 was one of them. We did camp there for a minute. 540, that didn't last very long. That was like the 540 to 550 area. And those are things that I just kind of take with a grain of salt. I've been repeating myself a lot lately, saying that I don't really feel that strongly about the downside, meaning like I don't have like a really definitive downside target. I'm just trying to be flexible with the chart. And I still believe that this setup could yield a very large move back to this diagonal, whether it be now or later in the future. It could even be after a much later, if we were to only have a mild run into earnings, for example, you could see something like that where, it's still coming down. I mean, it's absolutely possible. I mean, I had lows on that big chart of like 250. So for me, it's not so much about being perfectly right all the time, in so much as it is, well, if it doesn't do this, then what? And if we don't get the confirmation, then what? And so lately what's been happening is that we've been beating our heads against this kind of S-curve motif, and we've rejected several times, right? This kind of outer, you can call it a creek if you want, but this resistance pushing us down, and we just can't push over. There's not enough demand to reverse the stock at this time. Sellers are in charge. It's driving the price down. Really, this started on December 5th, but I would argue that December 14th is really when this sell-off took hold, and it's just been coming down ever since that spike. And until it stops, you're just trying to catch a falling knife. It's better just to wait it out and see. It really is. And if you want to play a hedge, you can play a hedge and hedge on the way down. Shout out to Nick P., who obviously, had called out that 540 area, or 450 area long before most people did. And I didn't really want to comment on it at the time. I didn't feel like I could comment on it. I'm not on like Twitter or whatever, and I didn't know where it was coming from. So I was just like, I don't really know. I think that's what I said is I can't really comment on other people's work. But it is an S-curve target. One of the ways you can draw the S-curve with a middle through like 705 basically gives you like a perfect 50-50 spin around the floor here, right there, and it takes you down to like that 450 area. So if he gets the call out, great. Like, kudos to him. He definitely should get some respect for that call out. I think it's appropriate. That was a really good technical call out if that's where it goes. Nothing but respect, right? On my part, for me, it would just be like, okay, well, I didn't think it was going to go that low. So yeah, I was wrong, but what now? You know what I mean? Does it change the entire setup? And I think the answer is no. So you might be expecting me to like backpedal and say, oh, everything's different. I don't think so. I still think that the motif that we picked out is the right motif. Now, when I say stuff like that, the danger is always in like assuming that you're right and that it's never going to be, it can't possibly be anything else. That's not what I'm trying to do here. What I'm saying is that I have a lot of confidence in it because I've noticed that it's kind of everywhere. And the more that I've kind of studied this chart and studied the way that this thing has moved over time, this kind of a move down the way it's moving down right now does not usually yield continuous downside without some kind of an upthrust. And this is the motif that's been used as we've been coming up to recheck these channel crosses. As you can see, it's the same angle that we've established right now, but ours currently has no check on it. There's really only 3 places the whole chart, as far as I can tell, that there's really no check. One is right here, and that's back up at $44. And there was never really any pushback up after we dropped in after hours. The other one is way over here. I mean, and these 2 points really signify some pretty serious, some serious price movement. But everywhere else you see that there's been support given, like come back here and look at this bounce that we had back in December of 2021. We went back and rechecked it later in this massive 160% move. The same thing applied afterwards when we dropped through here, and it looked really bad. Remember this big S-curve sell-off? And look at this line. It cuts right through the middle of the cat ears, and we do get this extra move months later, but it's 180% to the upside. And, some of these are a lot more mild. You return pretty quickly for the check. The short operator has almost never, not checked it, And so when I look at something like this, it's not improbable at all to say that that's going to probably happen. Now, when does it happen? That's the kind of the question we have to ask. How long does that take? Well, there were a couple different charts that I've presented recently. One is the big one that has this setup where I'm looking at all these iterations. That was the 20-minute one and the 2-hour one or whatever it was. And then I talked about it again, and we looked at more stuff yesterday. And those have to do with something that, again, it's everywhere on AMC. It's all over the place on this chart. And it's this distributive type model that sometimes turns accumulative, and there's only a couple times where that might happen, but it's basically just a Wyckoff bottom, and this is essentially it. And so what it typically looks like is that you have this kind of pile drive. It looks a lot like this, right? And then it also looks a lot like the macro right here, this push up with the big S curve down. And I think we're entering this kind of phase on the macro, and that's what I talked about in the stream yesterday. We did a lot of macro analysis, but this is kind of the most basic bottom structure that we have for AMC. If you invert it, it looks like a distribution, right? I mean, it's kind of straightforward. And all I'm doing is I'm charting out, at the end of the day, when I look at this and I'm charting this kind of move right here, I'm really looking at this right here. I'm looking at this kind of setup and how it sets up. And usually you see there's some kind of a U shape on the top, and that gives you an angle, and then it goes and meets it later. But there's also other things going on here. One is that there's usually again, this very clear drop through, and usually you end up coming back to there later, right? When you go through the cat ears, that ends up being a really important marker for later on. It ends up being this really significant place that you often return to. And if it's bullish, right, then it gets over this, and this is usually where your SOS happens, and then you take off. If it's bearish, then this is where you have a rejection in the case of a double up thrust with a cat ear kind of thing. It usually happens right here. So if I were to expand this outward, it's basically just a gigantic cat ear, and you can see that, okay? But sometimes when it's bullish, depending on how the bottom sets up and all that stuff, it goes to the upside. Well, there's other things going on too that I didn't really talk about. One is that when you go down, there's creek jumps, right? So you jump over the main trend, and you get these large M-shaped crosses, is what I call them. And they basically just signify exactly that. You're just jumping over creeks, and you're building support. You're checking levels as you go, and eventually you get over outermost ones, and you kind of take off. And usually it's there's all kinds of fun stuff you can do with the cat ears, and you can find there's usually a yin yang kind of thing going on. We see the same thing happening all over the place. This is the middle of the ears right here. You can see the M shape right in the middle, right? And it's jumping over all these creeks, and there's all kinds of other stuff. I'm not going to go into all that. We did it yesterday in the stream. It's quite a bit. It's an almost absurd amount of analysis. But I will say this, is that we have this setup on the macro, it's there. It is present, If you look at the big picture, and then you look at where we dropped off the face of the earth here, I believe that that's it. I think it's the same thing. I think later on in this stock's history, we're going to come back up and retest this line. I really do. But in order to do that, as you can tell, you have to jump over the creek, and we're really far away from it. So a lot of the stuff that I've been doing is trying to, especially that 1 year video looking at the whole years, estimate how quickly this is moving, where the bottoms may be, and they're low, right? And I even had people telling me that it was really bearish, the stuff that I was saying, even though I'm still talking about pretty significant moves here and there. They're like, oh, it's just too bearish, Where's the move to all-time highs? I don't know, if it's going to move to all-time highs. I don't think it will. I mean, it's kind of a given, right? It can't go there until it passes this level. Well, duh. But I think this is the most important kind of trend we have to deal with right now. Like, coming back up to here is a big deal because you have to jump over this creek. It's very unlikely that we race up there by February, in a month to $51. You know what I mean? Or something like that. So for me, when I look at this, I can see how there's going to have to be like a lot of these M-shaped crosses, right? Like we're going to have to make jumps at some point. Whenever we hit the bottom here, my expectation is that we're going to start making those bigger like leaps. You know what I mean? And that's when you're going to start seeing like, I don't know if it's going to be this big, but I think that's when you're going to start seeing a lot of pretty major swings, and you're going to be doing most of your accumulation low. I believe that the actual setup here favors low. I think it favors going down to $3 or $2, so that those M crosses might end up being super, super low. You may not see like anything super crazy until way later, and then we'll see, this could end up being another distribution down that comes down over time. And there was all kinds of stuff we did in the chart yesterday on the really long stream that I had that talked about this kind of stuff. Now, does that mean that this is exactly what it's going to look like? No, because the levels that I'm getting are estimations. Like the S curve comes down to like the 250s area. But if I'm a little bit off, that could be pretty severely off in terms of a bottom. You know what I'm saying? The concept here is simply this, that you're coming and you're starting to jump over creeks that exist as we're coming down. You'll start seeing those jumps. And this jump right here, the one that looks like this like massive March move, it's basically like the first jump. Does that make sense? It's the one that you're jumping over like the most basic of things, which is essentially like a trend. Okay, and I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, well, dude, I think we've already jumped over that trend, because if you draw that trend, it looks like we've hopped over top of it and we had no move. Like it just didn't happen. Well, yes and no. You're right. That did happen. And this is part of the reason why I was kind of like, I don't get it. She should have had that push up here to the 9s. It never happened. And maybe we're waiting, right? Maybe we're going to come back down and retest it here. But there's also a new trend, right? So now you have to deal with the outermost portion here, right? And once you jump that one, then what? Well, it's starting to look pretty severe, right? Because then you're basically out of the woods here, and you're free to go. And where are you going to go? Well, you're probably going to go back up to this trend, So that the kind of stuff that we're looking at, it demands like nuance, and I'm not going to do any sugarcoating when I get stuff wrong in terms of like targets, but I think that the flexibility has to be there. And I would hope that the audience that I draw is an audience that understands that. If you don't understand that and you think that it's rigid, and it's not, it's supposed to be some unchangeable thing, I just generally disagree with that. Like I don't believe that's the case. I think that there's probabilities in like returning to certain places right now. I think there's a decent probability of at least coming back up to 682. I don't know for a fact after that point that you're going to race all the way up back to some really absurd level, but I've still got targets that go from like $17 to like $23. And that 1440 is still one of my favorite targets. I still like that target. And that's one that I called out a while back. So I'm not particularly bothered by downside. I know a lot of people are. I'm just watching it. So like today, Divergence didn't hold. This is on the daily. It could still make a higher low, but it definitely didn't hold. So that's kind of a bummer. Hate to see that because there was a really decent amount of divergence here, but there was a strong bearish divergence on the top. So, I mean, you have that working against you up here, right? You can see it. And I don't know. We're waiting to see what happens. Previous lows, we haven't really ever been historically like super, super low on the daily except for some very, very significant places. Like one of them you can see here is that March bottom, that one was sort of like what we're kind of seeing right now, where you've got this kind of cat ear breakdown and then drops real low. It doesn't seem like it's ever going to stop, bounces out. Maybe this is more or less what we're going to end up experiencing in the long run is some kind of a long, slow bounce. And then there's going to be an up thrust later that goes ridiculously high. Okay. Even still, like, you see how it doesn't really matter if you use this one or you use this one. I mean, obviously, if I'm doing it wrong and and I'm doing this, and we're actually like only in this halfway point, then yeah, it's not going to get there when I think it's going to get there. But eventually, you're going to get that push up, right? And I think that we also talked about and so yeah, you just wait, right? That's what I'm trying to say. And I also talked about the levels here. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. I'm trying to switch topics really quick. I'm just trying to say this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Like there's support and demand levels here, and you can see which ones haven't been tested. Like we haven't come back up to 20 at all. And we've completely avoided it, and we just ran away from it like really far. We never tested it, and it's unusual because even in, again, these previous breakdowns, like this one right here was a nasty breakdown. I remember feeling like, oh no, it's never gonna come back up, but it still came back and rechecked that level, and it was a huge move, right? So for me right now, I'm kind of in that mode of like, well, even if it didn't come back up now, like it needs to come back up at some point in the future. And we're still talking about a strong probability of getting up to that $12 to $13 area, if not higher. And that would be a retest at the very least of this range here, which again, like we really didn't spend a lot of time in it. Like we barely hit it, and then we've kind of rejected on it and headed away. We really haven't dived back into it at all. So there's just a lot going on here that we could look at and we could analyze. At the end of the day, if I'm wrong about where we are in the scheme of things, if it turns out that this wasn't this bottom and it was really more like this bottom or whatever, it's going to have to be adjusted. But that motif itself, I still feel very confident about. Does that make sense? And I know that's annoying, but that's got to be what it is. I'm not going to spend an infinite amount of time on one chart, when I think it's probably okay. And we've had it, and that sounded really defensive, but we had another chart that was kind of like almost the exact same thing. And I said, this is probably my last big macro chart. And a lot of people were like, that's super like, not humble. And you've got a lot of hubris to say you're never going to do it. Well, look, it was this chart. I mean, it's basically the same thing because I was charting out the August bottom, I think, saying that like, yeah, I think this is pretty much it. And it's like these falling diamonds, these falling shapes followed by these buy-ups, and that's that downward momentum chart. This is really not that different. It's just a different way of kind of mapping it out. So what do I think, about the near term? Well, yeah, we're coming pretty low. I think that's a given. Obviously, like this cool off on our RSI happened while we were still kind of going down almost. So we really like chilled it out quite a bit, and then we started advancing downward again. We're already, in my opinion, oversold. But the way I have my parameters set, you can see that it stays oversold a little longer. And that has to do with some other indicators that I use. On the weekly, it hasn't been this oversold. August is not even a comparison, right? It hasn't been this oversold since back in 2020. And before that, yeah, there was another place where it was oversold and it had that buy up. Very different time, right? But right now, there's nothing really here that tells me like it has to be this or that bottom. I'm just waiting, okay? And I know that's frustrating for folks. I get it. Why don't I have an accurate target for bottom? Why do other people like feel really confident about their bottom? Meh, I don't know. That sounded weird too. It was kind of funny. I just don't. Like, I don't have that kind of confidence in my bottom targets right now. I'm really just waiting because I want to catch a big move to the upside. This kind of slow turn to the downside, you can trade against it if you want. You can hedge. But if you're trying to buy in on every drop, you're just trying to catch a knife, and it's dangerous, you know. It's not a good idea. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it and, you know, say that, oh, everything is perfect. It's not. I mean, my predictions were based on certain things, and if they don't work out, they don't work out. But you take ownership of it, you move on, and then from that point forward, right, we look at what do we do now, right? What are we looking for now? And so a lot of this video has been me just kind of rambling about that, so I apologize if that's kind of boring to you. I'm just trying to help people that need the help, right? If you're not one of those people, then don't worry about it. If you just want to know what the chart says, right now, I think if you finish this rotation and bounce out, we could be looking at a really low earnings, like around $6. We could be bouncing out around the fours or low floors. Somewhere beneath 450 is probable, and then you're going to bounce out. And I do think you're going to head back up, probably to retest this guy right here at 650. I think 650 is highly likely. That could be the run up into earnings, to be frank with you, and then we'll see what happens. Because I think earnings could be one of those like make or break things where you could end up with a massive run as a result of earnings, or you could end up or right into earnings, or you could end up with a pretty nasty drop, you know, after earnings. So we're gonna have to pay like special attention to any kind of a setup on a recovery bounce here. Right now, I'm not super optimistic about it just breaking out sideways again. I know I said that, but unless I start seeing another iteration like right now, and it doesn't make it makes a higher low, which was part of the macro chart I was talking about. I had it on there. I think it's here. Yeah, it needed to do this. Like, it needed to jump over and make so that's wrong, right? That didn't happen. We got lower. But it says that you should see an iteration fail to make a new low in LPS. That's still true. So what that would mean is that when it comes up and does a chop, instead of dropping and continuing downward, it drops, makes a new low, makes a higher low, and then starts pushing and advancing over the creek. And you can see we've moved away from it enough now. We've moved off that center line enough now that it looks pretty far off. It definitely feels like it's deviated from the path. And I think it's clearly, with the volume, very intentional deviation off that path, right? This slow churn is officially like sped up. So we're going to see what happens tomorrow going into Monday. I don't feel like you're going to see like some kind of a harsh spring-like action. There will be one if this continues to beak down like this, like go straight down, because there usually is a harsh reaction at the end of those S-curves. You usually get a really sharp, like 20 to 40% move. I mean, sometimes it's really, really high, depending on how far and how fast. It's kind of like the reactive move is like the bounce out, but this is one that I'm not looking for some kind of like V-shaped recovery necessarily. That's pretty rare. There are very few times where this kind of happens. It does happen, but I'm just telling you, like, it's very few and far between. It's like, it's what I call the shallow S-curve, and frankly, every time I talk about it, I have to like think like, where did this even happen? Like, but I know it's happened because I've charted it before, and it does happen, and I have gone back and looked at it. And it's basically where like this bounces out. It looks like it's going to finish the S-curve, but it doesn't. And there's a change of character, it reverses, and you get these really harsh reversals that turn into these big spikes. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen here right now because of how far it deviated. It looks like it's driving along the main S curve, not along the kind of wraparound trajectories that we wanted for the iterations down. Okay, so for now, I do think that that is not as likely going to happen. Okay, that being said, it's a 25-minute video. It's long enough. You heard enough from me if you've been listening the whole time. Probably sick and tired of the weird lecture. I am going to do my best to do a recap video of the week. I'm probably going to be starting a part-time job within the next few weeks. So it's something that I want to do, so I'm going to do it. And it's something I'm interested in, so I'm going to be assuming that job beyond what I already do, which is this and the animation stuff. I want to do this other thing. So I'm going to be less and less available this year. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to start the year with like a big video, is I was thinking about the future and how I'm probably not going to be as available to do like daily and whatever updates. So for now, like this is, in my opinion, like the best course of action is try to do the bigger kind of outlook videos and then change them and tweak them as we go, instead of sort of like molding clay, instead of trying to like just keep up with the here and now. So I feel like I've set up a structure and now I can kind of use that. And then we'll see, we'll see what happens as we kind of build out that structure. Okay. All right. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you have a good one. We'll talk to you later.